Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about how it works when a defendant receives consecutive felony sentences. It's governed by the so-called single sentence rule, and that tells the prison system how to calculate the total aggregate sentence. There's a little bit of math involved, and so that makes it a good topic for the whiteboard. So we covered in other sessions how when a defendant receives a sentence, let's say of 10 to 21 months, that there's actually quite a bit going on in the background in terms of the way the minimum and maximum work, how post-release supervision works at the end of that, and we covered that in those other sessions. So if you have any questions about that, please take a look at those. Of course, as many of you know, not all defendants get convicted of just one thing. So today what we want to look at is how it works when a judge imposes sentences for more than one felony. So let's work through an example. We have our two judgments here, 15 CRS 001 and 15 CRS 002. And I've already gone ahead and filled out the sentence for the first one. 001 is over here, a 10 to 21 month sentence. What happens when the judge imposes another 10 to 21 month sentence in CRS 002 and orders that that sentence is to begin at the expiration of the sentence imposed in 15 CRS 001? So how does it work when the judge orders these consecutive 10 to 21 month sentences? That situation is governed by statute. It's 15A 1354 subsection B. So there you see it. And this is the statute that the prison system refers to as the single sentence rule, because it tells them that when a person is committed for consecutive felonies, they get treated as though they've been committed for a single term, with the minimum of that term, we'll start with that because it's a little bit easier, is just the total of all the minimum sentences, and then the maximum, and this is where it gets a little more complicated, is the total of all the individual maximums minus 12 months for every second and subsequent B through E felony, minus 60 months for every second and subsequent Class B1 through E sex crime, and then minus 9 months for every second and subsequent Class F through I felony. Now the reason we do that subtraction is because every felony maximum sentence nowadays includes time built into it for post-release supervision, but when a person is released from consecutive sentences, they only serve one term of post-release. So we need to do that subtraction to purge out the extra time that is built into all but one of the sentences. And so I realize that it's a little complicated to talk about these things in the abstract, so let's take this rule and apply it to the consecutive 10 to 21 month sentences that we were talking about earlier. So we have a 10 to 21 followed by a 10 to 21. What does the single sentence rule say about how that consecutive sentence will be administered? Well, it tells us that the prison system will treat it as a single term, and the aggregate term is going to be determined by, first, let's add up the minimum sentences. All we do is take the total of those, so 10 plus 10 is 20. So we have that done, check. As for the maximums, what it tells us to do is add up the total of all the maximum sentences, so that brings us to 42. And then, because these are Class F through I felonies, we're going to subtract 9 for the second and subsequent felonies. The reason we do that is because both of these from the sentencing grid are inflated by an extra 9 months for post-release supervision. So we're going to subtract 9 from the aggregate maximum to get rid of, to purge out the 9 months that was built into one of them. And what that's going to leave us with is a 20 to 33 month sentence. If you think about it, that 33-month maximum is exactly what you'd expect for a 20-month minimum. If you looked at the sentencing grid for Class F through I felonies, you'd see that the maximum that corresponds to a 20-month minimum is 33 months. And so that's actually, looking at the sentencing grid is actually a way that you can check to see if the math that you did on our maximum here is correct. The single sentence rule sets you up for a single term that can be administered according to the usual rules for, in this case, a Class F through I felony. And if you wanted to put that single term on the timeline that we've used in other modules, you could see it would go to a 20-month minimum, a 33-month maximum. The release by default is going to be the maximum minus 9, which for this person would be 24 months. The release is going to be somewhere between 20 and 24 depending on the accrual of earned time, and we're going to save this 9 months of imprisonment out there for the defendant's single term of post-release supervision, and that PRS period for this Class F through I felon is going to be 9 months. Of course, this is somewhat of an easy example in the sense that we only have 2 consecutive felonies, and they're both of the same variety. They're both Class F through I felonies, so that makes the math and the application of the rule a little bit easier. Let's work through a more complicated example that brings all the different pieces of the rule together. So this time let's assume we have 6 judgments, all set to run consecutively, and then just to make sure we test out every part of the rule. We have all these different types of judgments and more than one of them. We have 2 Class B1 through E sex crimes, those are our red ones at the top. We have 2 regular Class B1 through E felonies, the blue ones there, and then at the bottom we have the Class F through I felonies. What does the single sentence rule tell us about the way this string of consecutive judgments will be served in practice? What it tells us is that the prison system will treat this person as if he or she has been committed for a single term, and the minimum of that collective term will be the sum of all the minimum sentences, and that'll conveniently add up to 100 in this case. The maximum, and this is where the challenge is going to be the sum of all the maximum sentences, and trust me that winds up being 282 months. But remember that all of these maximum sentences up here, the individual maximums, are inflated to cover the post-release supervision period that would apply to each one. So the sex crimes are both inflated by 60 months. The B1 through E, regular B1 through E felonies are inflated by 12. And then the regular Class F through I felonies are inflated by 9 months. But remember that the defendant's only going to serve one term of post-release supervision at the end of this string of consecutive felony sentences. So what the single sentence rule does is get rid of that extra time built into the maximum for all but the most serious offense, the serious term of post-release. So it's going to subtract 60 to get rid of this second or subsequent B1 through E sex crime. It's going to subtract 12 and 12 again to get rid of both of these, and then subtract 9 and subtract 9 to get rid of both of these. And what that's going to leave you with, if you do the math, is a 100 to 180 month sentence. And once again, if you looked at the maximum sentence table in the sentencing grid, that 180 month maximum is exactly what you'd expect for a 100 month minimum for a reportable sex crime, which is in essence the lead offense in this string of consecutive judgments. And finally, in terms of the administration of the sentence, if you want to put it out on this timeline, from 0 to the 100 month minimum to the 180 month maximum, for this Class B1 through E sex offender, the release by default is going to be the maximum minus 60, which for this person brings you to 120. That means the release is going to be somewhere between 100 and 120, depending on how much earned time the inmate accrues, and we're going to leave this 60 months hanging over the person's head for a single term of post-release supervision, and the length of that term of post-release supervision, because this is a Class B1 through E sex offender, is 5 years. So at the end of all these sentences, on post-release supervision for 5 years, with these remaining 60 months of imprisonment hanging over the person's head. Let me wrap up with a couple final thoughts about the rule. First, notice this window right here, which represents the defendant's opportunity to accrue earned time. That window, in this case it's 20 months, would be the same regardless of the order in which the judge imposed the sentences. Sometimes people try to have the longest sentence last with the idea that that maximizes the defendant's opportunity to accrue earned time. But because this is all addition, and because the prison system's required to treat it as a single term of imprisonment, the order in which the sentences are imposed doesn't matter. Last but not least, remember that the single sentence rule is a rule of sentence administration, not a rule of sentencing. All of the individual judgments should show the full regular sentence, straight from the sentencing grid. This subtraction over here is something that the prison system will do automatically. Of course, you want to be aware of it when explaining to a person, how long their total sentence will be and what their post-release supervision period will be at the end, but it doesn't get reflected in the individual judgments themselves. Thanks again for watching. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.